Good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you to discuss how much red meat is good for us, and particularly the importance of transparent, evidence-based health metrics in evaluating how much red meat is good for us. My disclosures, and yes, like many of the presenters here, I'm an omnivore. I'm going to start by reminding you of what is a healthy diet. And the WHO defines that as a healthy diet needs to do two things. It needs to protect against malnutrition in all its forms. And it also needs to protect against non-communicable chronic diseases, such as heart attacks, strokes, and cancers, and diabetes mellitus. I'm going to focus on the latter, because the previous two presenters have talked a lot about the value of meat and animal source foods in protection against malnutrition. But I'm going to remind you also that we're not doing very well. To the left panel, you can see that almost 2 billion out of the 7.5 billion of us are either overweight or obese, and therefore at risk of non-communicable chronic diseases. It's an absolute shame and a disaster that almost 1 billion of us actually do not get enough calories and go to bed hungry. We have talked about hidden hunger. This is where the diet is sufficient in calories and energy, but actually qualitatively is inadequate. In particular, deficient in essential amino acids, quality protein, and also key vitamins and minerals. And as the next slide shows, many of those key vitamins and minerals and essential amino acids actually come from animal source foods. So of the top commonly lacking nutrients, iron, zinc, vitamin D, calcium, the 20 foods that are most rich in those commonly lacking nutrients, 18 of those are animal source foods. And the right-hand panel shows that where average calories from animal source foods are less than 30%, vitamin and mineral deficiencies are much more likely. One of the most stark outcomes from poor maternal and childhood nutrition is childhood stunting. And that's not just small children, that's children whose brains are less well developed. And they're less well able to engage with education, less academic achievement, lesser careers, and therefore less earning opportunities into the future, lesser ability to support their families, and you get a vicious circle of more childhood stunting in the next generation. In the top left panel is shown the distribution of childhood stunting, and the pink colored countries, sub-Saharan Africa and Southeastern Asia. 1 in 3 children are stunted there. Greater than 30% of children are stunted. They're the exact same areas where meat consumption, dairy consumption, and seafood consumption is at its least. Too little animal source foods is also not good for the elderly. So these two 2022 publications show that if you are eating very little animal source foods or very little meat, you are going to live a shorter lifespan. But I'm a doctor, and I don't want climate change to happen because I'm absolutely aware of the health consequences of climate change. With climate change, we will have more extreme weather events. We will have more desertification, endangering food security for the world. We will have more infectious diseases, And we will have more inequalities, more violence, more migration, all leading to health consequences. So in actual fact, I welcomed one of the first attempts to balance food needs with planetary needs, the Eat Lancet Commission's reference diet, which was published in the Lancet in 2019. And I actually do agree with increasing our intakes of fruit, vegetables, legumes, nuts and seeds. But I have extreme concerns about the recommendation to halve meat and dairy intakes and the 90% reduction in red meat consumption. Now, the Eat Lancet Commission said that if the whole world switched over to their diet, that we would save 11 million deaths from chronic diseases, from heart attacks, strokes and cancers. But they were going to result from the reduction in calories, the reduction in salt intake, and the increase in fruit and vegetables that was mandated by the Eat Lancet reference diet. It wasn't going to come from the halving of meat or the marked reduction in red meat, because red meat was only causing, excessive red meat consumption was causing 25,000 deaths, according to their figures. They didn't take account of the fact that halving of dairy would increase cancer and cardiovascular deaths, nor do they take into account all of the nutritional deficiencies that would occur with halving of meat and dairy intake. They also didn't consider, what were we going to replace the meat and dairy with? Were we going to replace it with ultra-processed meat and dairy alternatives? Because the currently available plant-based meat and dairy alternatives are ultra-processed foods. They're very high in sugars, salt, and multiple cosmetic additives. So the Beyond Meat burger does have approximately the same protein content as steak, maybe not the same quality, but the same actual amount. It has 5 times the salt. The jackfruit and mushroom products are even worse, much less protein and even more sugar and salt. And you certainly don't want to be feeding your infants almond milk. Very little protein, very little zinc, and twice the salt. Since the Eat Lancet reference diet publication, there's been a number, in fact, a large number of further publications that either recommend a dramatic reduction in all animal source foods or indeed exclusion of all animal source foods from the human diet. So one publication actually stated that a single serving of a Frankfurter sandwich results in 35 minutes of life lost. Another publication said if we excluded all red meat and all processed meat from a Western diet, women would live 3 years longer and men 4 years longer. I'm going to focus in on one of those publications, and that's the Global Burden of Disease 2019 Risk Factors Study. And the reason I'm going to focus on this study is because it's hugely influential among scientists. So all of the other publications either use data from the Global Burden of Disease publications, or they use a similar method of analysis. Furthermore, the Global Burden of Disease publications are hugely influential. So they're quoted and influence the policies of the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the European Commission, yes, Farm to Fork used the 2017 data, the National Food Strategy for England, and as I said before, the Eat Lancet Commission reference diet use their data. Global Burden of Disease collaborators know that they're very influential, and their leader from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation, University of Washington, Seattle, actually recently described the global burden of disease studies as the de facto source for global health accounting. Now, if you are that influential, it is of even more importance that your data and your analysis are accurate, reliable, and evidence-based. So we're going to have a closer look at the 2017 risk factor analysis and the 2019 risk factor analysis. And that's what's shown for dietary risk factors in this slide. The excesses are towards the top of the diagram, the deficiencies towards the bottom of the diagram. And as you can see, the big excesses are high body mass index or excessive calories and excessive salt. The big deficiencies are child and maternal malnutrition, diets low in grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts and seeds, and omega-3 fatty acids. Global burden of disease in both the 2017 and 20 analysis did state that diets that were low in dairy or low in milk were causing deaths. But that's an underestimate because they only counted the protection afforded by dairy towards colon cancer. Just a point, in the left panel, you can see that the majority of the world's population are drinking less than 1 helping a day of milk. In fact, considerably less than that. By contrast, in the right panel, you can see that up to 3 portions or 3 helpings of dairy actually protects against colon cancer. What wasn't included in either the 2017 or the 2019 analysis was the protection afforded by dairy to heart attacks and strokes. So the PURE study, Prospective Urban Rural Epidemiology Study, a study of 21 countries, low income, medium income, and high income countries, showed that if you drank at least 2 full fat dairy servings a day, you were 32% less likely to have a heart attack or stroke and 25% less likely to die. And this is confirmed by a further study which actually looked at biomarkers of dairy intake. So didn't rely on self-report of dairy intake, measured in the blood a biomarker called serum pentadecanoic acid as a measure of what was the true dairy intake for that individual's. The higher that biomarker in blood, the less likely you were to have a heart attack or stroke. In 2017 analysis, it was estimated that 1.5 million deaths were occurring because of long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid deficiency, insufficient eating of oily fish. That was reduced without any explanation or any evidence provided to 300,000 in the 2019 estimates. And even then, they only counted protection against cardiovascular events. They ignored that both in early life and in later life, considerable protection to the brain is offered by the long-chain omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids, EPA and DHA. And we know that the world is not eating enough omega-3s. Only 20% of the world reports eating the recommended intake of EPA and DHA at least 250 milligrams per day. But what I'm going to talk about for the rest of this brief talk is unprocessed red meat. In the 2017 analysis, 25,000 deaths were attributed to excessive red meat consumption. That increased 36-fold in the 2019 analysis, up to almost 900,000 deaths. Again, no evidence presented. They reported that they had conducted new systematic reviews and meta-regressions, which showed that there was a causal relationship between red meat intake and heart attacks, breast cancer, ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, and they'd added that to previously identified outcomes such as diabetes mellitus and colon cancer. And those 6 relative risk curves are illustrated in this slide. And I want you to note that they said that for each of those 6 outcomes, there was an increasing risk with increasing red meat intake. And for each of those outcomes, highly statistically significant, as the 95% confidence intervals did not include a relative risk of 1. The majority of the world is eating less than or equal to 75 grams of red meat, unprocessed red meat per day. Many of us are eating considerably less than that. So that's the range of red meat intake that is important. And that translates into less than or equal to 4 portions a week of unprocessed red meat. The right-hand panel shows what the Global Burden of Disease 2019 analysis says is the relationship between unprocessed red meat intake on the horizontal axis and relative risk of death. So they've added together all of the deaths due to breast cancer, colon cancer, heart attacks and strokes, and diabetes mellitus, and said that from the first mouthful of red meat, that there is increasing risk of death. So from 5 or 10 grams a day, which would translate into maybe 1 very large steak per month, you are at increased risk of death. And that risk increases the more red meat that you eat. Highly statistically significant relationship. But that doesn't agree with the published evidence from the large published cohort studies. So I've shown the 10 largest studies that have looked at the relationship between red meat intake and mortality or death. None of these studies show an increased risk at a red meat intake of less than 25 grams per day. Only 2 North American studies show an increased risk at intakes between 25 and 75 grams of red meat per day. If you look at the European studies, the Asian studies, and the global study, the PURE study, in fact, it's only when you go beyond 75 grams of red meat per day, so that's greater than 500 grams per week, do you find some of the studies showing an increased risk. Some of them don't show an increased risk with no matter what the intake is. Because of our concerns about the disparity between published data and these relative risks that the Global Burden of Disease 2019 had produced, we sent a letter to the Lancet. This letter came from 6 professors from 6 different universities, from Ireland, the UK, Belgium, and Australia, and we asked 2 key questions. Where are the peer-reviewed publications of their updated and new systematic reviews? We need that information in the form of the PRISMA statement, which provides all the detail so that we could actually evaluate the quality of the evidence. Where's the evidence for changing the red meat optimal intake, or in technical terms, that's the theoretical minimum risk exposure level, or the TMREL, for changing that from what was previously established as 22.5 grams per day to 0. And we also asked them, have the additional deaths and illnesses that would occur from iron deficiency anemia, elderly fragility, child and maternal malnutrition been included in your estimates of harms from unprocessed red meat? It took 9 months for our letters to be published, multiple obstacles and multiple delays. A month later, a response from Professor Christopher Murray on behalf of the Global Burden of Disease Risk Factors collaborators admitted multiple errors. Now, they didn't offer to correct those errors, despite the fact that once errors are confirmed, it's mandatory according to the Lancet's guidelines and according to the two committees that control medical and scientific publications, that there's immediate correction of all confirmed errors. They still haven't answered our key questions. Again, it's mandatory according to the Lancet's guidelines and according to those two committees that evidence is produced for all estimates. And they're still persisting in not including the totality of nutritional effects of red meat. Just recently, a month ago, we were delighted that the Academy of Nutrition Sciences and the World Cancer Research Fund joined in the call for producing the evidence. They said that they supported Stanton and colleagues. They used terms such as justification, reconsideration, lack of transparency, undermining of authority, troublesome, unsupported by the evidence, and unrealistic. We've had considerable media and scientific interest, both from specialist journals and also from the mainstream press. Again, on social media, we've had a lot of activity and interest, and I'm just going to quote one comment from Professor Gordon Guyatt from McMaster University. Professor Guyatt is one of the founders of evidence-based medicine, and what he said was, calls for evidence remain unanswered, even in latest author's response. Big problem. I agree, it is a big problem. Now, just 10 days ago, Nature Medicine published a series of articles from the Global Burden of Disease collaborators concerning burden of proof. One of those papers concerned unprocessed red meat. And as you can see from the 6 panels, they've reevaluated the risks between unprocessed red meat consumption and colorectal cancer, breast cancer, heart attacks and strokes. And they now say that actually only one of those is statistically significant. That's the relationship with colorectal cancer. All of the rest have no statistically significant relationship. So they say there's weak evidence of an association between unprocessed red meat and colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes mellitus, and ischemic heart disease. However, in actual fact, it's not a weak relationship. If it's not statistically significant, it's a null relationship. And I cannot understand how these 3 associations are still awarded a 2-star rating. They say there's no evidence of an association between unprocessed red meat and the 2 types of stroke, ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, but they still award it 1 star. This is very puzzling. They now say that the optimal intake of red meat may not be 0. In fact, it could vary from 0 to 200 grams of red meat per day. They say overall that the evidence that unprocessed red meat is associated with increased risk of disease is weak and therefore is insufficient to make any stronger or more conclusive recommendations. And I agree with their last point. We do need more rigorous, well-powered research in this area, and we're starting to get that. So just this year, there was a biomarker calibrated study This means that they didn't rely on self-report of red meat consumption or self-report of calorie intake. They used biomarkers to actually check whether that was a true measure of the intake of red meat and energy. And once they did that calibration, there was no association between red meat and adverse outcomes, cardiovascular, heart attacks, strokes, nor cancers. So I will conclude. Animal source foods, dairy, meat, fish, and eggs are nutrient-rich foods. The relationship between red meat and disease burden is mere J-shaped. When eaten as part of a balanced diet, red meat provides considerable protection against nutritional deficiencies. There is low certainty evidence that relatively small deleterious effects possibly occur with excessive consumption. So consumption in excess of at least 500 grams weekly, so the 75 grams daily. The majority of the world's population are not eating enough dairy nor omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acid rich foods. If we try and replace animal source foods with plant-based ultra-processed foods, so as to solve greenhouse gas emissions, that will very likely harm health. And it is women, children, the elderly, and those of low income that will be particularly adversely affected. Lastly, and importantly, policymakers should be extremely wary of global health estimates that are not rigorously and transparently evidence-based, or that ignore the protections against nutritional deficiencies afforded by animal source foods. Thank you very much.